Good morning-ish, soon to be afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to have a great interactive session related to Toolkit for Parents, Anxiety and Unexpected Behavior. My name is Sarah Cannon. I'm one of the directors of special education in the Douglas County School District. I'm pleased to introduce our presenters today, Keith Souza, our behavior specialist team lead, and John Smith, our behavior specialist. They're going to go over the presentation. We hope to have some time for questions at the end of the presentation. Some questions were pre-submitted and we will try to address as many of those during the session as possible. You can also put some a question in the chat and we will follow up if we don't have time for questions with an FAQ that we'll post on our website after that's completed. So I'm going to turn the session over to Keith and John.
All right, thanks, Sarah. I'm not sure if people can see us or not, but this is Keith speaking. And then John, do you want to just share your voice?
Yep. Hey, good morning, everybody.
So today we're going to be talking about anxiety and specifically around kind of the parenting component of anxiety. And so for the agenda for today, we're going to do an overview of just kind of what anxiety is. Then we'll get into how to manage it, some parenting strategies and looking at next steps. And really 45 minutes to an hour will flash by trying to talk about this topic because it is a very large topic to cover in this amount of time. So we're going to try and get in and move at a good pace and give a good overview and get to some real practical things that people can do to kind of help your kids out. And so we'll move right along. We'll kind of get into the first slide here. John, feel free to jump in. I'll get us started and then we'll go from there.
Okay.
So one of the things when we talk about anxiety is we tend to, think of it as a real negative, and we've got to be careful not to pathologize just the human kind of concept of anxiety. Anxiety does serve a function for humans. It helps us survive. It helps in a lot of different ways. And really, some anxiety can be good. It can help with growth. It can help us kind of push past what we've been used to, which is often uncomfortable when we push past our own ceilings. And then we create a new kind of benchmark of where we can move to. And so we don't want to look at every situation that produces a little bit of stress or anxiety as a negative, but it is definitely a teaching time for our kids. And it's something that we can help our kids kind of work through and grow into a little bit.
Yeah, and I'll say I'll probably bring this up a couple different times, but our goal when we feel like kids have moved more into that chronic or toxic or maladaptive kind of reaction to their anxiety, the goal actually is not to eliminate anxiety. And sometimes we'll make that mistake just as parents or as staff in schools to send a message to kids that, well, just try these things, calm down, and then the anxiety will go away. And that's not necessarily the goal. That we want kids to learn that they can manage and work with all of the feelings and sensations that go along with anxiety, not necessarily just get rid of them all. Because they, again, as Keith said, they can be useful.
Right. And we look at some of those kind of more challenging pieces of anxiety. And these are the ones that a lot of you probably have experienced with your kids. Some panic, social anxiety, separation anxiety, general anxiety. And so a lot of times our kids will be reporting these different things or we'll notice it in our kids. And we're just not sure kind of how to manage it and how we kind of got to this point. So we'll dig in a little bit as to kind of like the why and the how and where we got here. John, do you want to add anything here?
Yeah, I'll say, so even though we can kind of divide out different types of anxiety, the actual approach in trying to help our kids kind of work through that and learn to be resilient with those feelings of anxiety, or it's often the same. It may on the surface look different, like, oh, this is a phobia or this is a social anxiety thing, but the actual approach and some of the underlying mechanisms just neurologically and psychologically are very similar. So I noticed in some of the questions submitted ahead of time, there's specific situations and how do I help my kid with this particular thing. And while at some point there may need to be more specialized, in general, a lot of the things we'll share here today can be applied to any given type of situation or behavior, because there's some very similar underlying mechanisms going on with anxiety.
So we'll probably pause on this one for a little bit, and I'm sure John and I will both have quite a bit to say. So when we think about anxiety, we'll start with this metaphor of a cup. And if you think of like a coffee mug or a big kind of like a big giant travel mug, or if you think about a tumbler for water, you've got all these different size cups. And people come to the table with a variety of cup sizes on what they can manage. And if you think about the different things that pour into that cup, and if I had a visual and I had a cup and I was pouring a pitcher of water into the cup, and every time I was pouring a couple of drops in, I was naming something that was a stressor or a challenge, and we can look at it through the adult lens, we can look at it through the kid lens. Maybe I'm a high schooler and my alarm doesn't go off, so I pour some water in the cup. And then I go out to my car and it's covered with frost and ice, and now I've got to scrape all that off, and now I'm running even more late. I get to school, I've poured more water in, I get to school and I realize I have a test that I haven't prepared for, I pour more of that water in the cup. Well, eventually those start to kind of pile up inside the cup, and the cup is right at the cusp and it's about to kind of spill over. And it doesn't take too many more things to kind of overflow that cup. And that cup size, one thing we want to do is, one, we want to figure out how do we create more space in that cup? And two, how do we kind of get a bigger cup in a way? So some of that is genetics, some of that is life experience, some of that's what we've learned and been reinforced with over time. But think of this metaphor of the cup, and you can even look at it through your own lens. A lot of us can relate to a series of things maybe not going well, and then all of a sudden our cups are pretty full and about to spill over. John, you want to expand on any of that?
Just to add that when we look at just even temperament, they can study infants and gauge some general temperamental kind of dispositions that babies have, and some of those endure well into adulthood, and kind of anxiety continuum is one of those. So there's a clear sort of genetic component to that sort of endures. As some kids just are a little more on the stressful side of things and more reactive to stress, while others are more on the chill side of things. And then you combine that over time with different life experiences, different stressors, different reactions of people around them, and so on. And then as we'll get into this a little bit later, that there's a learning component that interplays with environmental experiences and then that predisposition or that temperament.
Yeah. And, right here is, a lot of times when our kids are experiencing anxiety, we wonder, what are we seeing here? And so things to be on the lookout for might be some kind of escape or avoiding type behavior. Maybe they're pulling away from things. Maybe they're not as engaged as they once were. Sleeping challenges often get reported. And I would say that sleep is a bedrock, fundamental human component that needs to be addressed. So many of the students that we work with in the district report sleep challenges, and it really amplifies anxiety and as well as other kind of mental health challenges. And so sleep is a major piece that we see. You see nervousness, shutting down, loss of appetite. When you think about your kids and you think about them at like baseline, kind of like the best versions of themselves, if you start to see subtle changes, keep an eye on those things and one, filter them through the lens of, okay, is this a developmental change that is appropriate and just kind of the next chapter in their lives, or something going on, and is this kind of a little bit of anxiety that's starting to manifest here?
Yeah, I think I want to expand on the next slide. So one of the things that's sometimes difficult to understand about anxiety is the below the conscious or subconscious kind of nature of it, that the mechanisms that are at play are in a very primitive part of the brain, which makes sense if you really think in its most fundamental purpose. Anxiety is survival. That when we're faced with a dangerous situation, we don't have to take time to think about it and to ponder our choices and think about our options and problem solve. We had to react, and we have to react quickly in order to survive. And that's, we may be familiar with that fight, flight, freeze response, that largely is involuntary, that our brains will take over. We've all experienced this. If something startles us, we jump. Or if we step into the street and the car was there, we didn't notice, we just react and withdraw from the street without thinking. And that's good. We want our brains to be on autopilot so that we can maintain safety as best as possible, quickly as possible. The challenge in our modern era is that our brains are still wired for a more outdoor, more kind of primitive lifestyle in a way, that there's a lot more threats and dangers out there outdoors and in the wild in our earlier human days. Now, modern times, there is less actual, at least in our country, there's a much less physical threat to our safety. But our brains sometimes still are primed to look for threat and danger. And so it can overgeneralize. And so what in the past might be a response to an approaching saber-toothed tiger, for example, now we have a test that we are faced with, for example, and our brains will then at that subconscious, out of our control level, start to ignite all of those responses in our body that would normally prepare us to run or to hide or to fight. So in that image there, you can just sort of see all sorts of different body reactions that we see kids have when they have chronic anxiety. And it really, as you're looking at all those are all things that are preparing our bodies to be safe. We need to be able to run. Our muscles have to be activated. We have to increase our heart rate and our breathing and on our blood pressure and open up our pupils so we can see what's out there in the environment and so on. It gets our bodies ready. And those feelings then can become urgent, first of all, and they can become very uncomfortable to the point where, like with a panic disorder, people will describe feeling like they're having a heart attack. So it really feels like something's seriously wrong. But even below that extreme level, all of those feelings, the faster heart rate and breathing and tighter muscles and nausea, because our bodies, we don't need to digest food when we're in the middle of an unsafe situation and so on. So we feel these very uncomfortable, and the kids feel these very uncomfortable sensations, and they want it to go away, understandably. And on top of that, then when all of that is happening in our body, our thinking parts of the brain, it says there, the prefrontal cortex, all up here behind our forehead, the brain withdraws resources at that point. We don't need to be thinking about math if our bodies think that we're in danger. Our brains withdraw some of the thinking resources, and it gets even harder to kind of reason and rationalize and work with kids when they're having these anxious feelings and all these things going on with their body, because they don't want those feelings. And on top of that, they're not able to think as clearly. So a lot of our approach with anxiety is what we call from a bottom up, where we recognize that kids are in that survival kind of self-protective fight, flight, freeze kind of brain. And we need to kind of meet them where they're at. And this is where we'll get into in a little bit here. But just even recognizing and acknowledging to them that, yeah, this feels terrible right now. It feels maybe even scary, or I know your body's telling you it needs to do something, it needs to move. And just even acknowledging that can help kids feel like they're not crazy and that they're better understood. And that in and of itself can settle down some of those physiological reactions and help them get back into a more thinking kind of brain. Keith, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just, while we're kind of talking about the neurology of it all, one of the reasons we really want to address anxiety and a number of other things is that it's Hebb's theory in neurobiology that when neurons fire together, they wire together. And the more we fire off a bunch of neurons, the more we myelinize those neurons and wire them up. And so one of the challenges is if we are starting to have that kind of panic response to environmental stimuli over and over and over again, it becomes an automatic neurological pattern in a way when we're presented with that stimuli. And so we want to address it and start to kind of overwrite that a little bit and help that change go forward. John, did you want to talk about the future thinking, or I can just jump in for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
So it says future thinking, ... And a lot of times with anxiety, it's our thoughts kind of leading us into the future. And instead of being grounded in the present, focusing on the here and now, our thinking is off in the future. And the challenge with that for adults and for kids is that the future is an unknown. And we start to make all of these predictions about the future. And then we start to ruminate on those. And as we ruminate and predict, it leads us down this path. And we start creating this cycle of thoughts and how they are impacting our feelings and how they're impacting our actions. And we cycle right around all of this. And that anxiety future thinking can really stymie us for how we're dealing in the present. And more often than not, a lot of those things do not come to pass. And so to help kind of narrow that and bring us back into the present and being, this is where mindfulness comes in, bringing us kind of grounding us is a big piece of this.
So yeah, the next slide, then there's a kind of phrase out there called the anxiety equation that in general, when anxiety becomes chronic and moving into that sort of toxic or disabling kind of realm, that there's two things going on here, that a kid or even adult is expecting worse outcomes than is likely. And the other part of the equation is that they underestimate their ability to cope with those perceived or predicted stressors. So in other words, in our minds, if we're anxious, we increase the danger or the threat or the problem, the degree of the problem out there. And we limit, or we are not even aware, or not able to think about all the resources we actually have in order to manage those and work through, endure, mitigate or minimize some of those stressors. So we shrink our resources in our mind and we increase our dangers. So the three main drivers of anxiety are an overly negative expectation of a future event or outcome. And then that's combined with avoiding that. So I fear something, and so I'm not going to face it. And that each time it's not faced or withdrawn, it kind of is rewarding because the stress goes away. And then that erodes, actually, in reality, erodes a person's confidence in their ability to actually face or cope with those stressors. Each time they avoid it, they kind of learn that they can't face it, and it becomes sort of self-fulfilling. Then on top of that, as teachers, as parents, coaches, whoever, the adults around our anxious kids sometimes will inadvertently reinforce those anxious feelings, either by allowing it. Oh, I see you're really upset and bothered by it, so okay, you don't have to do this. Or sometimes as adults, we're anxious ourselves. And so we sort of telegraph those negative expectations of the future as well. Or our own worries, just in the way we interact with our kids, can kind of filter down, and they pick up on those as well. And so we start inadvertently reinforcing that by the way we allow kids to avoid stress, or the way we talk to them about stress, and kind of in a way we can validate their negative thinking just by allowing them to get out of something. It sort of says to them, yeah, that must be really bad. Even the adults are agreeing in a way, and they're not necessarily thinking it that directly, but boy, it must be bad if they're not going to make me kind of face some of these stressors. Now there's a balance, and so we'll get into like how to think through that and the best way to help kids. Because again, just as you may well know, if you have a highly anxious kid, we can't just force kids into very stressful situations either. That could potentially overwhelm them and backfire. But overall, we want to make sure as adults that we're responding in a way that teaches them that the danger is not as bad as their minds are telling them it is. And they actually do have some resources within themselves, or they have other resources outside themselves, other people or other tools at their disposal to help manage and make it through stressful situations.
John, you want to do the next slide, and then we'll get into kind of how we start to manage anxiety?
Yeah, sure. So this kind of just recapitulates through what we've been talking about up to this point, that we can think of anxiety as a bunch of cogs in a mechanism there that all kind of interrelate with each other, that the negative thoughts or negatively predictive thoughts that kids might have about upcoming stressful events kind of interact with emotions, that those thoughts themselves generate those stress reactions. So no longer with anxiety is even the actual event happening, but even the thought of an event can evoke all of those same physiological reactions, heart rate and the breathing and the tight muscles and the headaches and all of that, just by thinking about a possible stressful event. So that links to the body, then that creates emotions and reactions in the body. And then that interplays with what's going on around them and then their own actions, kids' own behaviors. And typically with anxiety, it's that avoidant behavior. That the minute kids feel that stress come on, then they want to withdraw. They want to do anything to reduce those feelings of stress and not face the thing that is stressful to them. And so it all becomes part of this cog in a mechanism, because then once they back off and don't face something stressful, then they've done nothing to convince their minds that the negative thoughts maybe were overblown, because they didn't have a chance to actually face those stressful situations. And so they may not have a realistic perception. And so then it just becomes this self-fulfilling cycle once again of igniting the stress responses and then creating kind of reactions from other people around them and so on. So it's all interrelated. And so the approach to helping kids work through anxiety is to kind of make note of which of these, or maybe it's all of them, and make sure we're kind of doing things to help kids at each of these points on that diagram there, helping them with their negative thoughts, helping them manage strong emotions, helping them do things with their body to calm it down, arranging the environment and people's reactions maybe in a different way, and helping them learn coping behaviors and successful behaviors to work through the stress rather than avoid it.
Great. So as we get into general interventions here, one of the things that I talk about a lot is that, we want to really exercise that prefrontal cortex. And John referenced that, the executive skills, a few slides ago. And that prefrontal cortex is in development. So for all of our kids, it is actively developing now, and it's ebbing and flowing. There are peak periods where it's starting to grow and myelinize. And there are other times where it's kind of like powering down a little bit and pruning things out. And so you will see a natural ebb and flow to a certain degree. And these are pretty predictable in neurological development. But we want to make sure that we are exercising these skills. And the executive skills, and we don't have them here, but just generally speaking, it's emotional regulation, it's organizing, it's planning, it's initiating hard tasks, it's inhibiting responses, kind of stopping ourselves from doing certain things. And so we kind of want to make sure that we've got those pieces and we're working on those. So some of the pieces here, we've got build independence in day-to-day life. The more independence that we can start to foster, and this is all developmental too, for those of you with younger kids, that's going to look a lot differently in kindergarten, first and second grade than it is in high school. But we want to start to kind of step that up. So we're fostering that independence. We're encouraging kind of curiosity and flexible thinking and kind of giving things a shot, taking a chance on things. And when we do that in a structured, kind of safe way, we can start to build up that confidence. And going back to that cup analogy earlier, we created a little more space in that cup. And we start to kind of push that ceiling a little bit. And then we also want to promote that independent problem solving. And these all might seem like real straightforward, but the way they help anxiety is we are really working on that prefrontal cortex. We're developing a bank of independence and solutions that our kids can kind of work through and leverage when things start to go off course a little bit.
Yeah, so these may be things even not at all related to the particular anxiety that a kid is experiencing. So if they have social anxiety or they're afraid to get to school for a particular reason, maybe that's not the place we start building independence and problem solving, because they're already stressed about that. We may find other things, maybe be thinking about chores around the house that they are about ready to do independently, but not yet, for example, or problem solving, maybe even just around a family movie night. Let's problem solve this. Whose opinion is what, and how do we work it through if we can't agree? So just kind of in general, building those skills around problem solving, independence, and not necessarily related to the actual stressor until we've maybe done some other things that we'll talk about here coming up in a second.
Yeah. Yeah. These are all very foundational skills to help with anxiety. So if we look at the next slide, when we look at environmental kind of components, structure, organization, predictability, pacing. So just a word about some of these, and just to kind of put it in the adult perspective. Most of us, I would say, as adults have uncovered a whole set of structures that help kind of minimize our stress and anxiety. And it probably took quite some time for us to kind of dial in and land on those that work for us. So think about yourselves. If you have to leave the house for an appointment and you can't find your phone or you can't find your car keys, does that elevate your anxiety or does it alleviate your anxiety? And it probably brings it up just a little bit. It's a few more drops in that cup. If, we could think of a million different examples, but like that. But over time, you've probably either learned to try and figure out how to structure that a little bit, like maybe putting your keys on a key hook in a certain spot or trying to put your phone in a certain place. Maybe you've put a tile so you can locate your phone if you can't find it, or find my iPhone kind of thing. But you've worked through that over time. And a lot of times our kids have not built those up independently yet. And so for us to kind of help teach those and help them work through those things, it can really help significantly. It's the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Our students who are disorganized can't find the assignment they were supposed to turn in. They didn't bring home the right book. They were supposed to have plans, but they've messed up the date and time. All of these little stressors start to build up over time, and then they don't have the bandwidth and the mental energy to manage the bigger anxiety provoking kind of pieces. So structure, organization, there are plenty of things in life that are unpredictable and unexpected. But when we can have a schedule and we can make some of the things that we have control over predictable, that can really go a long way. And like John said, these might not be addressing the specific anxiety provoking situations like someone reluctant to go out and participate in a sport, or getting into school, or setting up a play date, that sort of thing. But what we're doing is we're creating the bandwidth for kids to then start to tackle those things. I think of the analogy of a computer. And if you've got your computer screen open and you're running 10 to 20 different tabs open, and you've got a video playing in the background, well, the battery's draining, it's working slower, it's not at its optimal level. And as we kind of do some of these pieces, we start to kind of clean all that out. We stop running those different things. So when we can make meal times predictable, how much time we have for screen time predictable, when we're going to do homework and making that predictable, those kind of pieces really help, open up the bandwidth for our kids.
Yeah, and I'll add too, even like stress reliever time. So making that predictable, like knowing, finding the things that are relaxing to our kids and having that actually scheduled so that they know in their mind, okay, I can get through these stressful things. I know I've got these times when I have predictable downtime. And I will add too, even specifically for you to address specific fears or anxieties kids may have, sometimes we can create a plan. We often try to convince them that it's not as bad as it's going to be, which is ultimately true. We need to do that. But often we have more success when we can work with our kid and say, okay, let's talk about what is the worst thing? And maybe we temper that a little bit, not the worst thing, because we could predict all kinds of crazy worst case scenarios, but let's realistically, what's the worst thing and that you're most worried about coming up? And okay, if that does happen, what's a plan? And so we can create little mini plans for what would happen if what they're worried about actually does come true. And so that even having a plan, knowing what they can do in those situations, sometimes reduces the stress so that they are able to then face it.
Yeah. Great. All right, let's move to the next slide. So kind of coming back to some of these, go ahead, John, you want to start?
Nope, go ahead.
Some of these biological pieces, and these are real, again, real kind of essential and basic, but it's amazing how many of our kids are falling off on some of these different things. Sleep, nutrition, hydration, exercise, research galore on all of these components and their relationship to mental health. I kind of mentioned sleep already. Nutrition is a big one. Kids who are kind of hungry, I wouldn't say malnourished by any stretch, but even just hungry, that signal of hunger then can increase some anxiety if we feel like some basic needs are not being met. Hydration, being dehydrated by even 10% can have an impact on kids and adults' neurological functioning. And so this goes back to that kind of being powered up all the way. We know activity and exercise significantly helps alleviate symptoms of depression and anxiety, and that's been ongoing. A lot of times, our kids might not want to exercise, and I will lean towards activity. What kind of things can we do that are active, whether it's building something out in the garage or taking the dog for a hike or doing anything that kind of gets the body moving. It doesn't need to be a specific exercise kind of regimen kind of piece. And then we've got like some of the classic pieces of muscle relaxation, that progressive kind of component where we kind of work our way through the body. And there's all different pieces of this. So you can Google it and find all different ways to do that progressive relaxation. Same with deep breathing. People talk about deep breathing all the time. And a lot of times, or kids in school anyway, will report, don't tell me to do any deep breathing. I've had enough of deep breathing. And there was really quickly, there was a study a few years ago, and they looked at Navy SEALs, and they looked at the different people that were able to make it through the training. And they did a meta-analysis of all the different variables. And one of the things that they found was that those people that could regulate themselves through deep breathing during times of stress helped them get through those moments and kept them in the program. So it's a powerful tool, and it's, we talk about it a lot, and it might even be overused at times, but it sure does help with a lot of pieces. And then we've got kind of like using our senses to get grounded. When our brains shift out into that future thinking, we want to ground ourselves back in the present. We can notice things in the environment. We can try and touch something and see how it feels, just to kind of bring those senses back to the present.
Yeah, a couple of additional thoughts. While we're not nutritionists, generally speaking, and the research is pretty clear that what we know about good eating is true for anxiety then as well, that having a good balance of protein and complex carbs, not the simple sugars, absolutely helpful. And the basic healthy oils as opposed to the unhealthy fats. And you can certainly search, there's some nutritional supplements like L-theanine and supplements that help neurotransmitter called GABA that can be helpful too. And of course, that needs to be in conjunction, with consultation with doctors. But there are some natural and nutrition-based approaches that can absolutely helpful for kids with anxiety. And one other thing, and then we'll move on. That we're also finding that it's called bilateral stimulation, where something as simple as when kids can kind of tap their shoulders back and forth. Now they may not want to do that in front of other people, but privately, or even tap their leg back and forth, can be helpful because it's creating neural pathways across both sides of the brain. There's even more sophisticated. There's this device called touch points, where you literally can hold them, you can wear them, put them in socks or pockets, and they buzz back and forth and provide that bilateral stimulation on their own. At bedtime can be helpful, or right before stressful events. So there's some technology these days that can be helpful that is not, not a medication per se, but more a physiological, holistic approach. And of course, then medication is an important piece at some point for certain kids as well. And important to consult doctors at a certain point about that. So there's a whole range of options physiologically to help calm that automatics, that subconscious kind of response that is happening with anxiety.
So we're really building our way up here. You know, a lot of you might be thinking, okay, well, how do I get my kid into kindergarten? How do I get them to do this X, Y, and Z? As we build up, we want to start with these foundational skills, build these up, and then we start to have the wherewithal to start tackling more of the cognitive strategies that we're going to get into a bit. But then we can look more specifically at the specific maybe phobia or anxiety that's presenting, and now we've got the foundation to work with it.
Okay, so number one, and this is where it's tricky. So we want to balance validating, acknowledging to kids that it's hard. I remember years ago, my daughter had high anxiety around storms, and there was just clouds. There wasn't even a storm coming, and I kind of pushed to go on a bike ride, thinking that she'll see lots of other people out there with their kids. There was moms with strollers even. I'm like, surely she'll see that other people think it's safe and it's fine. No, not at all. Not at all. All that happened was she thought, well, everybody else is crazy. Why are they out here? It's dangerous. And so that kind of backfired. So we have to balance validating, acknowledging from their perspective. And we're a different person than they are. Yes, I understand it's hard right now. It's very stressful. I get it. And not try to convince or push in that moment, sometimes just being understood. But then we also want to help them start to separate themselves as a person and those negative thoughts. And so we can talk to them about that worry part of your brain, or the stress alarm, or for older kids, we can literally talk about their amygdala, their brain structures, and it's that piece of their brain that is sending stress signals. It's not them as a person, and there's not something wrong. They're not choosing to misbehave. That we get it. It's really hard. That worry part of your brain is really pretty active right now. I understand, but helping separate that is important. And on the next slide, then we can kind of give an analogy of glasses. Can we go to the next slide? So we can kind of help them understand that our brain sometimes will look through filtered glasses, that in some cases we overestimate the danger. Everything's dangerous. I can't do this. I can't problem solve. It's terrible, or overly negative. No one likes me. I do everything wrong. And we want to kind of give them the analogy that we can put on realistic glasses. We don't have to convince them that life is rosy and perfect. We can just simply help them understand, maybe there's a different set of glasses we could look through and a little more realistic. Can we talk back to some of those worry thoughts? Can we come up with some evidence that maybe proves that some of those thoughts aren't completely true, aren't 100% true at least? And so even just giving analogy like the worry glasses versus clear thinking kind of glasses or realistic glasses can help kind of distance their anxiety from them as a person and keep that self-esteem a little bit more intact.
Yeah, just John just mentioned the word evidence, and that's something that we'll often ask adults to help kids work through, because it can be hard to find the evidence that is counter to maybe that catastrophic or negative thinking, but it almost always exists for the most part. And if we can help them uncover that and work through this, and something I think we should come back to, and this is the tough part about trying to squeeze this into a short period of time. When we're working with our kids on this, we want to make sure that they're in a regulated space. What happens is if our kids are dysregulated and they're kind of maybe in a higher level, and we've got a model, it's called the crisis development model, and it goes baseline is when someone's calm and rational. The next stage up is the anxiety stage, where they're losing some of that rational control. The defensive stage is the higher level, and they've kind of really lost that rational control. Well, as they're going back to that neurological piece, as they're getting into that defensive stage and more in that primitive part of the brain, they're not in a good space to problem solve and find evidence and use cognitive strategies. So ideally, when our kids are regulated, we're coming back around and working on these kind of things. And this is probably one of the challenges that we face as adults. We are often called into action when our kids are in those higher level stages because they are dysregulated. They're crying, they're upset, they're emotionally fragile, they're avoiding things. And so we jump into action, we help them manage that. And then they get through it. And we're like, okay, gosh, now I got to get back to my own job, or I have to do X, Y, and Z. And we really want to make sure that we come back when things are more calm and rational to kind of talk through these things, because that's when the greatest amount of learning will take place. Oops, John, did you want to jump on this one?
Yeah, sure. So sometimes, and yeah, to Keith's point, a lot of the things we're going to be talking about here in the next few minutes are best done not in the moment of high stress. That in those moments, it may just be a matter of just validating, being there, helping them kind of do some breathing and calm the body down before we can access the brain. But at some point, it's really helpful to help kids quickly kind of identify what level of stress they're at. And on the next slide there, we have just an example. Kids often come up with their own analogies that are really helpful because they came up with it. But one common one is the idea of a thermometer. So if you go to the next slide, we can help kids. In younger kids, maybe it's a 1 through 5 or 1 through 3 even, just very simple, but where they can put a number to it. And it helps put their stress in perspective, first of all, and it can over time start to talk about, hey, yeah, this situation was, and that looked like it was maybe a 4 or 5 for you. Whereas this situation, yeah, I could tell it was really more at a 9 or 10. It's just a quick way to acknowledge. This helps kids put things in a greater perspective, but it also accesses their thinking brain in a quick way, in a simple way. So if they are stressed, may be hard to put words to everything, but they may be able to put a number or put up a finger. Or I've had kids using a volcano analogy instead of a thermometer. And where are you? How much lava is starting to come out? All sorts of different analogies that may make sense, but it is a way to quickly reference and identify kind of where their stress is at.
Yeah, another way you can use this too is once they identify kind of where they're at, later on you can come back and say, okay, what would make it a half a degree better? You know, if I'm at a 5, what would make it a 4? And then we can start to generate some solutions based off of that. John, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah. And then on the next slide here, while we want to do our very best to convince our kids that they're maybe overblowing the stress and the threat in their minds, it typically backfires, as I said before. So we kind of have to go through the back door as best as we can. And that's where we can ask questions more than try to convince. And so we won't go through all the questions here on this slide. So you'll be able to access this presentation later. But in general, we can ask questions ahead of time about what they think may happen without trying to convince necessarily, because it's much more powerful if they learn on their own. So as long as we're asking questions and then they don't 100% avoid the stressful situations, then later on the next slide, then there's questions we can ask following a stressful situation. And over time, when we're just engaging in a dialogue, helping them come to their own conclusions, then they can build that resilience and start to challenge their own negative thinking. Because ultimately, by and large, 2 very important things happen when kids are dealing with stress. One is typically what they worry about doesn't come true 100%, typically, not 100%, but most of the time. And the second thing is, even if it was stressful, they made it through. So that's back to that anxiety equation again, that we want them to come to their own conclusions that they're in their minds overblowing the threat and underestimating their ability to cope. So all these questions get at that one way or the other of helping them recognize the overblown thinking and realize, wow, I made it through it. I did it anyway, even though it was hard, even though I didn't like it, it felt uncomfortable, but I did it anyway. And I survived it. And in fact, I've survived every situation I've ever faced in my life because I'm still here. But we want them to come to that conclusion. Otherwise, they may try to convince us back that we don't understand. So we have to be careful not to be too convincing or cajoling and more questioning.
Yep. And then there are questions to ask after a stressful situation. So now we're kind of comparing and contrasting. And so we're checking in, did you get through it okay? How did you manage to face up to this? One of the things with these questions, depending on the age and the development of your child, you might want to write this down. You might want to have this documented somehow. For younger kids, and maybe it's more visual. For older kids, it might be more of a journal or on a whiteboard, and we're kind of taking a picture of it. What happens sometimes is, when we're working through this and we're kind of building up a new kind of neural pathway on how to manage all of this, we tend to forget. In a lot of times, the learning around this will take some time. It doesn't happen automatically. And so the more you can kind of document these conversations in a way, not as I got you when they don't remember it next time, but more as a way to kind of reflect. And if you think about this as building up a skill set, if you wanted to get better at anything, whether it's playing piano or playing basketball, you'd practice, you'd study it, you'd work on it. And so dealing with this is very similar, where we've got to have some way to kind of reflect back on what we're working on so we can get better at it.
So overall, then summarize, we validate. It's really, really important. It's one of the things that I just think in general as adults, we overlook or do less of than needed. Validate, empathize, I get it, I understand, or help me understand. Even better, especially teens. They're going to be convinced you will never understand them. Okay, well, help me understand. I'm here to listen and without convincing in that moment. But we also can't let them completely avoid stressful situations. So let's go to the next slide. And what happens with stressful situations is that, when we're first facing it, our anxiety spikes. It accelerates pretty quickly, and there's some point where it peaks. And then finally, over time, or the stressful situation goes away, of course, then it decreases. That's pretty straightforward. But the problem is, and this is what we can help our kids understand too on the next slide, when there's avoidance in the picture, that stress spikes, kids will avoid the stressful situation, and that provides momentary relief. It's very powerful, very reinforcing. However, the next time they have to face that stressful situation, the stress actually goes even higher. They perceive it is even worse before because their brains got reinforced for avoiding it and didn't have to kind of work through that stress. And then they avoid, and then there's momentary relief again, and then it rises again, and on it goes until the point where we get to more chronic and toxic anxiety of kids refusing to go to school, or withdrawing and shutting down and avoiding relationships or stressors of all sorts. So we have to help them understand that each time they avoid, it only makes the anxiety worse. Instead, we can talk to them about the curves of the brave, and that's on the next slide here, where yes, it's hard when we first face it, but the next time we face it, it's a little bit better. And then the next time it's even better, and so on. Or I've used the analogy of a pool. When we first jump into a pool, it often feels really cold and shocking, but after a while, you stay in there, it's not so bad. Then actually, when you get out and jump back in, it's nowhere near as bad, at least for quite a while. And so it get better and better. And we need to help kids understand that as well, that just avoiding it only will make it worse over time. Now, that's got to be balanced, of course, with not just without any warning, shoving them into the pool, into the deep end, into a freezing pool. That's overwhelming. That can create panic. So that's why then we talk about in the next slide here, what we call an exposure hierarchy. You can even go to the next slide here, where we can take, and this is why it's helpful to have a thermometer kind of idea as well, because we can take all the stressful things, all the steps of a stressful situation and break it down and lay out kind of the easiest steps to do to the hardest, so that we maybe don't force our kids to do the very hardest thing right away. We break it down and have them do small steps, like toe in the water first, and then your foot, and then your knee, and slowly get used to it. And so we can set up different ways of doing that. Sometimes it's even just imagining it, or looking at pictures of things, or talking about it. Or then it's actually doing just something for a short amount of time, or a piece of it, and then doing more and more and more over time. And so we don't push them to the 9 or 10 of the stress level. We keep them around a 4 or 5 where it's more manageable. and help until they can get used to it, until those 4 and 5s actually feel more like a 2 or 3. And then when 2 or 3, you know, when they're ready to move on to the next one, they go to the next thing that's more like a 4 or 5. And then eventually that feels more like a 2 or 3, and so on. Not easy to do. And this is where that line is, do we need professional help or not? At some point, you feel like you maybe have tried some of these things and still it's either getting worse or just not getting better. Then, you know, that might be an indication where a professional could help kind of work through and set up a hierarchy like this in a different way. Maybe it's a matter of finding more and effective coping strategies first to help keep kids in those 4 or 5 ranges instead of in the higher and so on. But we can do this as parents too, a gradual toe in the water approach instead of an all or nothing approach.
Nate, can you go up the slide after this one? So John, you just kind of covered this one, and we're getting close to our time limit here. Went by fast. So John was just mentioning, you know, how to seek professional help. So we just kind of put some things out here to kind of take a look at. We won't read all these different pieces, but you know, essentially it comes down to this. If you're trying all of these different things, you know, anxiety can be a tough thing to kind of manage, but it is absolutely something that a lot of our kids can work through and improve upon and get better at. And so if you're finding as a parent that, gosh, I'm just not making the progress that I'm hoping to make, it's probably a good time to work with someone who has some expertise in the area and then can kind of help expedite the process. You know, one just kind of cautionary note, a lot of what we're talking about takes time to work. All of these pieces will work and they will show improvement. And you want to think of improvement in a couple of different terms. How often is someone getting anxious? How intense is that anxiety? How long are they anxious for? Frequency, intensity, duration. And those are the markers that you want to kind of measure to see if what you're doing is working, because we're not going to go from someone who is pretty anxious to not being anxious at all. But if it's going down in frequency, intensity, and duration, then you're probably trending in the right direction. Let's go to this one right here. Great. So on the school end of things, if you've got a student who's in regular education, we've got a robust, you know, core of school counselors who can help. And if you have a student who is in special education and an IEP, you can absolutely reach out to those mental health folks in the building. And so we've got kind of layers across the universal targeted and intensive level for all of our kids at school. Also, Douglas County is partnered up with Scott Cypers, and he's got a video series that's on the district YouTube channel talking about anxiety. And he really goes deep into the cognitive kind of components of that. So we touched on that for sure, but those are much deeper over there. Sarah, are we just about out of time?
Yeah, so I've gathered the questions in chat and I'll put those in an FAQ. Some of them are going to take a little time to answer. One of the questions was, you know, what if the school is the one that causes the anxiety? We want to know that. We want to partner with you. So like those resources that Keith mentioned, reach out to the school counselor or reach out to the school mental health provider. We can help. If the school is the one creating the anxiety, we definitely want to address that. We want to partner with you in those things. So please reach out to us. These are questions we'll add to the FAQ. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get in depth into the questions, but we'll get an FAQ out right after Thanksgiving break on our website, and we'll let you all know that it's there. I also captured the questions that were in chat as well, and I'll continue to grab those in the last couple minutes we have. Thank you for joining us today. I know it's a very busy time of year. I know this is a huge issue right now for a lot of students. In the meantime, I hope that you reach out to our district YouTube channel where the Scott Cypers work is. And a couple days yet, we can partner with you if we have some anxiety questions over break. It can also be an anxiety provoking time for students. So take a deep breath. We're all going to get through this together. And we'll get the FAQs off on our website as soon as we can after break. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Appreciate it.